800 years. That's how long it took for the scattered tribes of Germania to become something more. 8 centuries of migration, war, famine, plague, and slow, grinding change. The Romans who had pulled back from the Rhine were long gone, their empire collapsed, their roads overgrown, their cities half forgotten. The world that replaced them was darker, smaller, and more violent. And into that world, in the year 742 AD, a child was born who would change everything. His name was Karl. History would call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And by the time he was done, he had done something no one had managed since the fall of Rome. He had united most of Western Europe under a single crown. Not through diplomacy. Not through clever politics. Through iron, through war, and through a military machine that had no equal in the medieval world. This is the story of how a Frankish king became an emperor, and how the weapons he forged would shape the next 1,000 years of European history. To understand Charlemagne, you first have to understand the world he inherited. After the fall of Rome in the 5th century, Western Europe had fractured into dozens of competing kingdoms and tribal territories. The roads that had connected the empire crumbled. Trade collapsed. Cities shrank. The sophisticated administrative machine that had governed millions of people simply stopped working, and in its place came something much more primitive: local strongmen, warlords, and chieftains who controlled territory through personal loyalty and the constant threat of violence. The Franks were one of these groups, a Germanic people who had settled in what is now northern France and western Germany. For generations they had been one kingdom among many, fighting their neighbors, absorbing smaller tribes, slowly expanding their territory. By the time Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, came to power in the mid-700s, the Franks were arguably the strongest single power in Western Europe, but still far from dominant. Charlemagne inherited that kingdom in 768, when he was in his mid-20s, sharing power briefly with his brother before his brother's early death left him sole ruler. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a physically imposing man, tall, broad-shouldered, possessed of extraordinary energy and an almost frightening capacity for work. He ate simply, slept little, and could reportedly dictate letters and conduct business while dressing in the morning. He was also, by any honest measure, one of the most relentlessly aggressive military commanders in European history. In the 46 years of his reign, Charlemagne fought on average more than one major military campaign per year. He personally led most of them. He was not a king who sat in a palace while others fought for him. He was in the field, on horseback, directing battles and sieges himself, well into his 60s. But what made Charlemagne's army different wasn't just his personal leadership. It was what his army was made of, and specifically, what it was made of in a very literal sense. Iron. The Frankish military machine under Charlemagne was built around heavy cavalry, armored knights on armored horses, carrying iron lances, iron swords, and iron shields. This was not a new concept, but Charlemagne systematized it, funded it, and deployed it at a scale no one in Western Europe had managed before. The problem with heavy cavalry in the early medieval period was simple: it was extraordinarily expensive. A single fully equipped Frankish knight, horse, armor, weapons, equipment, cost roughly the equivalent of 20 oxen. In an agricultural economy where a single ox was a significant asset, that was an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth. Outfitting even a small force of cavalry required resources that only a very powerful and very organized kingdom could provide. Charlemagne solved this through a combination of conquest and administration. As he expanded his territory, the wealth he captured, land, livestock, silver, the spoils of war, was channeled back into maintaining and expanding his military. He issued legal codes that specified exactly what equipment his nobles were required to provide, down to the number of horses and the quality of the iron. He created a class of warrior landowners whose land grants came with a military obligation: you hold this land, you owe me soldiers, equipped to a specific standard. The iron itself was carefully controlled. Charlemagne placed strict limits on the export of Frankish weapons to neighboring peoples. He understood, Perhaps better than anyone of his era, that military superiority depended not just on having good weapons, but on making sure your enemies didn't have them too. The campaign that defined Charlemagne's early reign, and that showed his military machine at its most brutal, was the war against the Saxons. The Saxons were a Germanic people who lived in what is now northern Germany, between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers. They were pagans, fiercely independent, and had been raiding Frankish territory for decades. Charlemagne decided to end the Saxon problem permanently, not just defeat them, but absorb them entirely into his kingdom and his church. What followed was 33 years of war. Not one campaign, not a single decisive battle, but 3 decades of relentless grinding conflict, raids, counter-raids, pitched battles, sieges, negotiations, betrayals, and massacres. The Saxons would submit, be baptized into Christianity as part of the peace terms, then revolt the moment Charlemagne's army moved on to another front. Charlemagne would return, defeat them again, impose harsher terms, and march away. And the cycle would repeat. The most notorious moment came in 782, at a place called Verden, on the banks of the Aller River. After a particularly bloody Saxon revolt in which a Frankish force had been ambushed and destroyed, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. History knows this as the Massacre of Verden. It remains one of the most debated events of the medieval period, a deliberate act of terror designed to break Saxon resistance, or the inevitable result of a war that had gone on too long and cost too much. Perhaps both. What is certain is that it worked, not immediately, but eventually. By the early 800s, Saxon resistance had finally collapsed. The Saxons were incorporated into the Frankish kingdom, converted to Christianity, and their territory became a permanent part of what would one day be Germany. While the Saxon Wars ground on in the north, Charlemagne was simultaneously fighting on multiple other fronts, a logistical achievement that still impresses military historians today. In 778, he led a campaign across the Pyrenees into Muslim-controlled Spain, an expedition that ended in a tactical failure and the famous ambush at Roncevaux Pass, where his rearguard was destroyed by Basque warriors. The rearguard commander who died there, a nobleman named Roland, would be mythologized in the Song of Roland, one of the earliest masterpieces of French literature. History is full of defeats that become legends. In the south, he fought the Lombards in Italy, defeated them, and added their kingdom to his own, which also brought him into a close and complicated relationship with the Pope in Rome. In the east, he campaigned against the Avars, a nomadic people who had dominated the Middle Danube region for centuries, eventually destroying their power so completely that the Avars essentially disappeared from history. Each of these campaigns brought new territory, new resources, and new people under Frankish control. And each victory made the next campaign possible: more silver to pay soldiers, more land to distribute to loyal warriors, more iron to forge into weapons. On Christmas Day of the year 800, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The moment was carefully staged, and deliberately ambiguous. Charlemagne later claimed he hadn't known it was coming, that the Pope had surprised him. Almost no historian believes this. The coronation was the culmination of years of negotiation between Charlemagne and the papacy, a mutual recognition of power. The Pope needed Charlemagne's military protection, and Charlemagne needed the Pope's religious legitimacy. What the coronation created was something new and something very old at the same time. On paper, it was a revival of the Roman Empire in the West, a claim that the tradition of Rome had passed not to the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, but to this Frankish king in Aachen. In practice, it was the foundation of what would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would shape Central European history for the next 1,000 years. The empire Charlemagne built stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the Elbe River in the east, from Denmark in the north to central Italy in the south. It contained what would one day become France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. The borders he drew, or more precisely, the borders his wars created, are still visible in the political map of Europe today. But empires built on a single man are fragile things. Charlemagne died in 814, at the age of 72, an extraordinary lifespan for the era. He had outlived most of his sons, and the empire passed to his only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a capable administrator and a genuinely devout Christian, but he was not his father. He lacked Charlemagne's absolute authority over his nobles, and his reign was marked by civil war between his own sons. When Louis died in 840, the empire was divided by the Treaty of Verden in 843, split between his three surviving sons into what would eventually become the separate kingdoms of France and Germany, with a middle strip of territory between them that would be fought over for the next 11 centuries, all the way to the Second World War. The Iron Crown had shattered. But what Charlemagne had built did not simply disappear. The administrative structures, the military organization, the concept of a unified Christian empire in the West, all of these outlasted him. The German kingdom that emerged from the eastern third of his divided empire would, in 962, revive the imperial title as the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would endure, in one form or another, until Napoleon abolished it in 1806. There is a line that connects Arminius in the Teutoburg forest to Charlemagne on his throne in Aachen, and it is made of iron. 800 years apart, these two men represent opposite ends of the same transformation. Arminius used iron to keep his people free, to hold a line against the most powerful empire on earth and refuse absorption. Charlemagne used iron to build an empire of his own, to absorb others, to impose his will across a continent, to replace the empire that had once tried to conquer his ancestors. Neither of them created Germany. That would take another 1,000 years. But both of them shaped the land, the culture, and the military tradition that Germany would eventually inherit. The heavy cavalry that Charlemagne built would evolve, over centuries, into the armored knights of the Crusades. The administrative structures he created would form the backbone of the Holy Roman Empire. And the territories his wars defined would, after much more blood and iron, eventually become the German nation. The crown was iron. The sword was iron. And the legacy lasted longer than either. Next time on Bloodlines of History, the empire splinters, but from its fragments, something new emerges. Warriors in white cloaks bearing black crosses march north into the frozen Baltic, carrying iron swords and a holy mandate to conquer. The Teutonic Knights, Crusaders, colonizers, and one of the most formidable military orders the medieval world ever produced. That's episode 3. Subscribe to Bloodlines of History so you don't miss it.